All right, guys, so in our last video, we looked at Punnett squares as a whole, and we figured out how to use a Punnett square. We talked about how we use it to determine probability. What's the probability that somebody, parents with brown eyes that are heterozygous for brown eyes could have a child that has blue eyes? And so we went through this Punnett square and determined what the genotypes for a heterozygous brown-eyed individual would be. We filled in the boxes and we determined the genotypes, the ratio and the percents for that, and the phenotypes and the ratio and percents for that. I also gave you another video that you could watch as an option, just in case you wanted more practice or you were a little bit confused. But in this video, we're actually going to get to do some practice with Punnett squares. We're actually going to be practicing on this little worksheet right here. So if you haven't gotten that already, you need to get that right now. So there's a couple things about this worksheet. You're going to see 6 different Punnett squares. For each column, you'll see down here that it's talking about the characteristic. So it gives you the allele for dominant. So big H means that something's going to have 2 horns. Little h means that it's going to have 1 horn. So that's going for these 2 Punnett squares right here. In the next column, we're dealing with letter T's. And so big T would be a long tongue, little t is going to be short tongue. And in the last column, you see L's. So here in this Punnett square, you see that the alleles, the genotypes, are on the outside, so it's giving us the parent information. Number 6 is interesting, and we're going to take a specific look at this one in just a few minutes. But it's showing you the offspring, and it's going to be your job to figure out the genotypes of the parents. And here we're talking about long bodies or short bodies. So this is also 2 pages. It is stapled at the top. So if you flip this up, you're going to see some questions. A couple things about these questions. When you see number 1, it's talking about the first Punnett square. So all of these questions are talking about Punnett square number 1. Number 2, Punnett square number 2 has a few questions. It's right here. Okay. Number 3, even though this Punnett square is in a new column, the questions for number 3 are still down here in the second column. All right, so there's a few questions for you there. Punnett square number 4, dealing with tongue length still. Punnett square number 4 questions are right here. Punnett square number 5, okay, is right here. And you're going to be looking at these questions right here. And then lastly, Punnett square number 6, the last one on the page. You're going to be looking at the last couple questions. All right, I highlighted these so that you can see the difference. You do not need to do that unless you feel like you're going to lose your place answering these questions. So specifically right now, we're going to look through the first Punnett square. So this first Punnett square, it's talking about parents that have 2 horns or 1 horn. And the nice thing about this Punnett square is it's already given us the parent information. So one parent is along the side. I don't know if it's the mom or the dad, but I've got one parent right there. I just did it blue, so maybe it's the dad. And then I have another parent up here. So our job is to determine if we have, well, big H, little h, a heterozygous parent that has 2 horns, and it's crossed with a homozygous recessive parent, so that parent only has 1 horn, what's the probability for their children, for their offspring? Are they going to have 2 horns or 1 horn? So to fill in our Punnett square, I'm going to take the H that I see here, and I'm going to put it in my first block. And I like going block by block. Some people will take that H and put big H and big H right here, but I like to go 1 block at a time. Okay, so I know that one parent gave a big H and one parent gave a little h. All right, then I can go on. Over here, one parent gave a big H and one parent gave a little h. When we go to the bottom row, one parent gave a little H, and the other parent gave a little H. Again, I'm using different colors. You can just use the same color pen if that's what you'd like. This just helps me see where I'm getting the information from. The last box, this H is going to travel over. One parent gives a little H, and this parent also gives a little H. So we've completed our Punnett square. Hopefully that wasn't too hard for you. Again, we just brought all of these H's across, and we brought these H's down. And remember, I think it's easier if you have the capital letter first. That's properly how you write the genotypes. So let's flip open and look at questions for Punnett squared number 1. I'm going to zoom this in a little bit so you can see those questions a little bit more. So the first question is, what trait is being traced in this Punnett square? All right, well, we were talking about H's, and we went down at the bottom. We were talking about horns and the number of horns. All right, so that's how we can answer question number 1. The trait being traced is the number of horns. And this is actually a trait that can be traced. We have rhinos that have 2 horns and rhinos that only have 1 horn. So this is an actual trait that could be traced. All right, the next question says, which is dominant and which is recessive? Okay, well, dominant is capital letter, so I know that 2 horns is dominant. The lowercase letter is recessive, so that's 1 horn. So 2 horns is dominant. 1 horn is recessive. How do you know? Well, we know that because, well, how do you know that something's dominant? We know that something's dominant because dominant traits have capital letters. My pen is dying. Let's try this again. Dominant traits have capital letters. If you're having trouble writing in these spaces, you guys have all of this free space up here. So if you can't fit it, just write 1C, because that's what question we're doing, and you can continue writing your answers up here or on a separate sheet of paper. Question 1D asks, what are the parent genotypes? All right, so when we come back here, we're talking about the parents. They're on the outside of the Punnett square. And genotypes is asking, well, what combination of letters do we have? So one parent has a big H, little h. The other parent has little h, little h. So our genotypes, there are 2. We have big H, little h, and little h, little h. Letter E, what are the parent phenotypes? So the genotypes were the letters. Phenotypes, it's what we see. It's like a photo. All right, so if one parent has a big H is dominant for 2 horns. So we have 2 horns for one of the parents. And this parent has 2 little h's. All right, that's recessive for 1 horn. So one phenotype is 2 horns. The other phenotype for the parent is 1 horn. And the last question, how many offspring have the genotype big H, little h? So the offspring are the squares in the center. Big H, little h. So we have 1 big H, little h, and 2 big H, little h's. Those don't match that. So the genotype big H, little h, there are 2 that have big H, little h as the genotype. And then it's asking how many offspring have 1 horn phenotype. 1 horn phenotype would mean that we have to have 2 little h's in the genotype. Okay, so this is going to see 1 horn, and this is going to be 1 horn. So that's 2 that have 1 horn phenotype. So that's how you're going to finish this this worksheet. All right, you're going to do 2, 3, 4, and 5 the same way. Fill in the Punnett squares and then answer all the questions. I do want to look at number 6. Number 6 is a little bit different because it gives us the children's genotypes and it's asking us to figure out the parents' genotypes. So in this, we've got to use a little bit of logic. But when you look over here, we said the same letter that was up here got dropped down, and the same letter that was over here kind of got pushed over into each of these squares. So I think it's easier to start vertically and go up and down. So when I look at these two squares, I want to know what letter does this square and this square have in common. Well, I see this has a little L, but this doesn't. What they have in common are these big capital L's, which means that this parent kind of dropped those capital L's into place. Same thing happens over here. In common between these two squares is that big L and that big L. So this parent also dropped a big L into place. And we can look across too. Okay, so what these two squares have in common are the second big L's. Okay, they have those in common, which means that this parent gave them a big L. And down here, they have little L's in common. So that means that this parent also gave them a little L. I think it's always easier to start vertically because you'll be able to see what they have in common a little bit easier, and then you can go horizontally. With that information, you should be able to answer the questions inside. Okay, I'm not going to help you with those. There's one more video that I'm going to show that talks a little bit more about the genotypic and phenotypic ratio. So once you finish this worksheet, once you finish answering the questions, you're going to go on to part 3 of this Punnett square instruction.